Good evening. Good evening. I'm Jim Meiskens. I'm interim president here at the Graduate Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this fascinating program. Tonight, we examine the new book, Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World, by renowned economist Branko Milanovic. Guided by this important study, we'll look at the relationship between capitalism and democracy, and we'll consider inequality in a world where capitalism is the only game in town. Now, the Graduate Center is the place to be for these conversations, for conversations like the one tonight. Our public programs explore the most critical issues of our time and bring leading thinkers from the Graduate Center, from CUNY, and beyond to our stage. And we hope all of you will come back many times in the future as more of these programs are offered. Now, our co-sponsor for tonight's program is the Graduate Center's distinguished Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. Addressing pressing issues is a hallmark of the Stone Center. It is a leader in analyzing the disparities of income across countries and regions, and of public policies and institutions that shape those disparities. Tonight's program is also part of our two-year deep dive into understanding the promises and the peril of democracy. Last year, we presented events that examined the foundations of democracy, such as freedom of the press or the role of the judiciary. This fall, we take up some of the significant challenges to democracy, including what we might call tonight the promise and perils of capitalism. We're grateful for the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York for underwriting this timely and significant project. And now I'm honored to introduce our extraordinary panel of scholars whose research is bringing fresh insights into our understanding of capitalism and what it means for inequality and for democracy. Branko Milanovic is one of the leading experts in the world on income inequality. The chart he developed, the elephant chart, has been dubbed the hottest chart in economics because of its effectiveness in depicting rising global inequality. He's currently visiting presidential professor here at the Graduate Center and a senior fellow at the Stone Center. Starting next year, he will also be commuting to London, where he becomes a centennial professor at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences International Equities Institute. Before coming here, he was the lead economist in the World Bank Research Department for 2 decades and senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is the co-recipient of the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing Frontiers in Economic Thought. He's published widely on the methodology of income distribution and writes about inequality on his site, Global Inequality. His books are not only highly influential, they have a worldwide readership. Reviewing Capitalism Alone, the book will be focused on tonight, The New Yorker said that Milanovic is among the small cohort of leading economists who, and I quote, have been able to hold a mirror so that we Americans can better see ourselves. James K. Galbraith is the Lloyd M. Bentsen Jr. Chair of Government Business Relations at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and Professor of Government at the University of Texas in Austin. He has advised both China's Planning Commission on macroeconomic reform and the presidential campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders. The author of many books on economics and inequality, he was the co-winner of the 2014 Leontief Prize. Marshall Steinbaum is assistant professor of economics at the University of Utah and co-editor of the book After Piketty, The Agenda for Economics and Inequality. An antitrust scholar, he formerly served as research director at the Roosevelt Institute in Washington, D.C. And our moderator tonight is Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology here at the Graduate Center, and founding director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. She is the co-author or co-editor of a number of books: Families at Work, Policies for Reconciling Parenthood and Employment, Gender Equality, Transforming Family Divisions of Labor, and Income Inequality, Economic Disparities, and the Middle Class in Affluent Countries. So we'll begin tonight with a presentation by Branko, presenting some highlights from his book. The panel discussion will follow. This wide-ranging book covers vast sweeps of history and is truly brilliant in its intersecting of storytelling, erudite thought, and skillful use of data and empirical research. Our panel will focus on a few themes, and I encourage all of you to go out, buy, and read the book. Now, please join me in welcoming Branko Milanovic to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, James, for this really great introduction. Thanks to everybody for coming on a rainy day. We normally, of course, look at when there is a day of a presentation or discussion, we always look at the sky because we know that actually it's much harder for people to show up when it's raining. So I doubly appreciate your presence here. I have, just to let you know so that you know what we are sort of facing, is I've got 15 minutes. I will stay within this allotted time, and then we will have quite a lot of time for the discussion and for, you know, afterwards for your questions. And now let me start with the title, because many of you might find the title a little bit puzzling. Some people might guess right, some people might actually wonder what is in the title. The title is not random, obviously. The title is, as you can see, Capitalism Alone. The comma there is not random either. It has some meaning. But the point is that Capitalism Alone essentially wants to convey the picture, the image, that capitalism is the only mode of production in the world today, and that was something new. It is new not only in the obvious sense that since 1990, the end of communism actually left capitalism as the only sort of way to organize production, but if you go even further into the past and think of the first globalization, which happened in the latter part of the 19th century and all the way to 1914, of course we know that that was kind of a globalized capitalism which very much resembles what we have today, but people very often forget that at that time you still have in large parts of the world forced labor, not least obviously in the United States until 1865, in Russia until 1861, Central Europe actually forced labor until 1848, and Brazil until slavery until 1888. So essentially they were, you know, serfdom or, you know, small producers also, or slavery which coexisted with capitalism. Well, nowadays, of course, I would argue in a book, and of course that's why China plays such an important role, I would argue that capitalism is the only game in town, that China is a capitalist country. I will not talk only about that because there are many other topics in the book, but I just wanted to make this very clear in the beginning. The comma has also a role because in a sense, being alone is actually quite good because you don't have competitors. But as we all know in economics, not having competitors may not always be ideal because it might let you sort of play or use some of the features or exacerbate some of the features which may not be the best. So being alone is, I think, and that's what the comma, I think, to some extent tries to convey, has positive sides and negative sides. Now, the negative sides, of course, in terms of capitalism are obviously inequality, on which, of course, I worked, but also Jamie and Marshall and Janet for many years. So the book focuses on inequalities in the two systems of the liberal/meritocratic system, where actually use US data more than from other countries, and in the system of political capitalism, aka China, where also I talk about inequality, corruption, and so forth. In both cases, the objective is to actually look at the forces which lead these systems to become more inegalitarian, how these forces should be arrested or curbed, and how, if they are not curbed, might lead to plutocratic systems in both cases. So I'm not coming, maybe it would come up in a discussion, I'm not coming in one or the other way that the Chinese system would necessarily evolve toward a democratic system of the Western countries. I'm not even saying that the Western countries might become like China. There is a third possibility that the two systems would converge to a position where you have a very strong combination of political and economic power, at the top. But all these things, of course, are quite open. But the discussion of the forces that push inequality in the both systems do present really the core of the chapters 2 and 3. Now, the chapter 2, as you can see, it's about liberal/meritocratic capitalism. The terminology comes from John Rawls. I will not explain it, but meritocratic does not mean in this context is something which is necessarily good. Meritocratic in the context in which Rawls uses it simply means that there are no legal impediments which exist like in a caste system to you achieving certain positions in society. Political capitalism, the term comes from Max Weber. And of course indicates capitalism where you use political power for economic gain. Now, chapter 4 deals with the interaction between globalization and capitalism, and it looks at 4 different types of interaction between globalization and movement of capital, between globalization and movement of labor, including migration, between globalization and what it means for the welfare state, and finally between migration and corruption. I think actually corruption needs to be really reintegrated into economics because it has become so pervasive, and I think there are very strong links between globalization and corruption. Finally, the last chapter is a chapter which really addresses the ordinary life under hyper-commercialized capitalism, hyper-commercialized globalization, rather, where we may have commodification of many activities which in the past had never been commodified, including obviously now using our homes or our cars, not as personal property, which we've been doing until recently, but really using it as capital. That's something which Marx would have recognized very well. So it's essentially our personal property becomes capital. And that's, for example, I recently read there is a new company in London which is actually renting out different like clothing. You can not only take some very fancy clothing, but any type of maybe shoes, whatever. So basically, really, you are moving further and further into this commodification of ordinary life and leisure time. So that's chapter 5, and I will not talk much about that today. Now, let me start with chapter 2, which deals essentially with the US. These are the forces, I will not read them all, the forces which I think are systemic and which push towards higher inequality in societies of liberal or meritocratic capitalism. It starts with the rising share of capital in total income, as you can see. And that alone, and that's actually a very important point, that alone would not have been a problem were it not for the fact that there is a very high concentration of capital income. In other words, I know that it's kind of difficult at once to kind of think of this, but suppose that the share of capital in total GDP or total income of the country goes up, but that the capital income from capital or wealth is more or less equally distributed. However hard it is to think of this, because historically we know that the owners of property, owners of capital have been rich. But if the ownership of capital is equally distributed, the rising share of capital would actually reduce income inequality. Now, why it is not reducing it is because capital income and wealth are extremely heavily concentrated, and they are not concentrated among the poor, but they are concentrated among the rich. So that's why you have the rising capital share quasi-automatically getting translated into the rising interpersonal inequality. Then I discuss higher rate of return on the assets of the rich, which is, I think, a very interesting topic, which you have to ask yourself, if I have assets of $1,000 or $1 million, is the likelihood of me having the same rate of return the same? And of course, very often that's not the case. People who have higher assets also have higher rate of return, which of course exacerbates inequality. And then I will speak about so I will skip that, about the association. I mean, I'll show you a graph, so I'll skip it right now. Association between high capital and labor incomes, which I called, because I was kind of first to invent this, homoplutia. Comes from Greek, and obviously, how are you going when you invent a new word? You go back to Greek and you put two words, which, you look onto Google, and then later check with your Greek friends, does it make sense? Well, at first, of course, they don't understand. They say, well, it doesn't make any sense, but they say, okay, give me another better word, but they're short of words. They say, okay, fine, take this neologism and run with it. So that's what I did with homoplutia. We'll explain that in a minute. And then homogamy, which is an interesting topic, is increasing assortative mating of rich people marrying each other. And then finally, it leads to really what I think is crucial, last two crucial points. I will not really talk much about them today, but they are absolutely crucial, is the political control of the rich. Because if you don't have political control, I call that tying the knot on power, then basically that power can actually evaporate. But if you have the political control on political power, then you make sure that that economic power stays with you and moreover gets transmitted to your children. And that's the last 6th point. So let me then simply give you some empirical illustrations. Obviously, all of that is quite empirically sort of demonstrated in the book, but let me just give for 2 of them. This is the graph that shows you the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality. So the higher the Gini coefficient, the higher inequality of capital incomes and labor incomes. Labor incomes are red, capital incomes are blue. So what is striking there is a huge gap between inequality with which capital incomes are distributed versus labor incomes. We're talking about the Gini coefficients of the blue line of 0.9, which is like really extremely high. It's like if you have the temperature, it would be the temperature which is among the highest temperatures that you can imagine. And the red line, which of course is increasing also because labor income is becoming more unequally distributed. Look at the case of the UK in the 1990s and the Margaret Thatcher, that goes significantly up. Always remains, however, less unequal than the blue line. So the very fact that the blue line always dominates, if you will, the red line essentially means what I was saying before, that the rising share of capital in total income quasi-automatically pushes you toward the rising inequality between individuals. And I've taken here 4 countries. I actually have, dozens of countries. Most of that comes from Luxembourg Income Study, and of course, all of them show basically the same results. Now, the homoplutia, as I already mentioned, is the presence among some same people of both high labor and capital income. Here, this is based on the US data. You can see actually the percentage of people who are in the top decile by labor and by capital increasing constantly. Think of the following fact. If that number was 0, then you would be really in the world of classical capitalism where the capitalists don't really work, as they don't double as wage workers. And if that number were to become 100, that's an interesting sort of thought experiment. How would a society be where everybody, the top people, are both rich? All of them are rich in terms of labor income, so they really have very high labor income, and they have a capital income. It raises many issues, some of that we might discuss, some of them you can read about in the book, how to tax such a society, whether it is easier or harder, how it differs from classical capitalism. So then let me move very briefly on the case of political capitalism of China. Each of my chapters has a very nice introductory, I think, epigraph. This one is from Aristotle, as you can see, and I think it's very appropriate for a society like China. The political capitalism, I define it here again very quickly as the 3 essential features. First one, the efficient bureaucracy or efficient administration. The second, absence of the rule of law. And third, the state autonomy. The state autonomy means that you actually are not, that the state is not captured by interest, whether, capitalist or other interest, but it has the autonomy of acting and doing whatever it wants. Now, the contrast between, or the contradiction between the first and the second principle means means that essentially you have to have bureaucracy, which is sort of a Weberian type of bureaucracy, but that bureaucracy cannot follow the rule of law all the time, because you need to have discretionary power to actually punish somebody or to give privileges to somebody else. And that leads to what I argue, to the fact that corruption is endemic or imminent to such a system. So in other words, corruption is not an anomaly in such a system, but it's really integral part of the system. I'll show you a few graphs of that. So this is one of the many ways that you can, of course, look at the corruption in China. These are the official data. This is the amount of income, or actually bribery, that has been received at different levels of administration, county, prefecture, and provincial level. What you notice here is that actually as you go towards the higher levels from left to right, the amount of corruption rises, which is not surprising because obviously you can give a greater bribery, or you are selling the jobs or posts for more money if they are more powerful jobs, and it goes up. Also, the red line, the red bar rather, shows you the level of corruptions within the Communist Party apparatus. These are official data. They have actually thousands of names of people and how much money they made and over what years, or whether they are part of an organized group or they were just doing it by themselves. And secondly, that you see that actually in most cases, in this case 2 out of 3, in a different slide that I could show you also, it's actually in all cases the red bar is higher than the blue bar. So basically that's obviously where the power is and where the corruption is. I'm being asked very energetically to stop, and I will stop in 1 second. But I want to show you another graph from China, which shows here the Chinese elite, the top 5%, and again focuses in this case on the CCP, Chinese Communist Party membership. And what you notice in this graph is that, I mean, if you look very carefully in that graph, is that the members at the level of the top 10% and top 5%, these are the first 2 slides, they actually have the same income as the other people in the top 10% and top 5%. At the top 1%, they have significantly higher incomes, and what is also interesting, that gain is particularly strong among people who are actually private entrepreneurs. So that's where you have this combination of political and economic power of which I was speaking before. And unnecessary to say, you have that same, of course, combination of political and economic power in the United States. This is, I've already mentioned, so I will skip this graph. This is the chapter 4. That's a kind of a cool chapter, but I will not have to say anything else. And I would also simply highlight the fact that in this case I deal with migration, and I'm arguing that there is an inverse relationship, that this is a controversial point, that if you give migrants fewer rights, domestic population would be more likely to accept greater migration. I wrote that particularly with the view of what is happening today in Europe, where there is basically really rejection of migration, despite the fact that the continent is actually aging and in need of migrants, but for political and cultural reasons they are rejecting them. And then finally, it is my last slide that actually I think illustrates quite well what I discussed in the last chapter, where I discuss actually the role of capitalism in our ordinary life and in terms of the value system that we have more or less all accepted, and contribute to the further sort of growing power of capitalism, not only geographically in China, but also within ourselves and in our private life. So after exhausting my time more than that, I would like to invite the people who are going to criticize my work, and maybe some of them would praise it as well, and then I hope we'll have a nice discussion. Thank you very much.
Am I on? I seem to be on. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much, President Muyskens, for starting us off this evening. Thank you, Branko, for the whirlwind peek at this extraordinarily complicated book. I'm not with the technological revolution here yet. So on behalf of those of us on stage, let me say welcome to everyone here in the audience at the Graduate Center, and welcome to those of you joining us by live stream. We're very excited to be here this evening. Let me just say a few more words of introduction about the book, and then I'm going to tell you give a quick roadmap of the conversation this evening. I'm going to keep my comrades disciplined and on time here. The book here. Many of you know Branko. Those of you who are in the Graduate Center community, we were here on this very same stage not long ago launching Global Inequality, the book that indeed is known, of course, for the signature chart of the elephant graph, the elephant chart. And this book is in many ways a sequel, I would say. You'll see the footprints of that book, certainly in this one. So for those of you who kind of know the story of global inequality, I definitely encourage you to jump into this one. Also excited to say, as President Muyskens noted, the book is getting a huge amount of attention on Twitter, online, The New Yorker and The Economist, Foreign Affairs, many places. So all of us at the Stone Center, we're basking in the praise and we're hiding from the criticisms, but we are really following it. And just in the last couple of days, the book was named one of the 5 best economics books of the year by The Economist, and today a very long excerpt is published in Foreign Affairs. So I hope you'll get a chance to follow the book as well. Okay, without too much further ado, this is what I'm going to do this evening. I know you can see this already. It's an extremely wide-ranging book and very complicated. We're going to focus on 4 questions. First, we're going to talk about these 2 models of capitalism. Second, we're going to talk about prospects for reducing the rising inequality, specifically in the U.S. case. Branko put up a slide showing 6 sort of systemic forces behind rising inequality in the U.S., and he's put forth a very specific policy proposal, which I'm going to ask Jamie and Marshall to comment on. Third, he showed you a graph which proposes something quite controversial, the idea of trading off immigrants' rights against the receptiveness of host countries. And we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to close on the questions of democracy. Okay. Branko, would you do one thing for us just to get started? I've been sort of pushing my colleagues here to make sure we don't use too much jargon and too much technical talk that's not going to be transparent to most of us, including us on stage. Take a moment and define capitalism for us, and also capital.
Well, capitalism is defined, I think, very clearly, and it's the definition that is used by Marx. It is the definition that is used by Max Weber. I really did not want to stray from those very simple definitions. Capitalism is defined as having 3 features. One feature is that most of production is conducted on privately owned means of production. Secondly, that labor is hired labor, which means that capital hires labor, not the other way around. And the third one is that the production is decentralized. And just think for a minute, when I spoke of feudal or slavery or systems which existed before, or still might exist in some parts of the world, you essentially, in that case, you don't obviously have free labor, because free labor is part of capitalism. Or imagine the situation of cooperatives, or imagine the situation of self-employed. The cooperatives actually are not being hired by capital. It's actually individuals who are both capital owners and producers. So that's not capitalism either. Or imagine the situation where you had state ownership of the means of production. Well, that's not capitalism either. So that definition is very succinct, very economical, and yet I think very powerful, and that's why I'm actually using it, and I'm not a great fan of restarting now, inventing definitions for something which has existed for 2 centuries.
Okay. Let me move on to the panel. So I think you all know that a very large part of this book is laying out these 2 models of capitalism. The liberal meritocratic capitalist model, of which the United States is the exemplar, not the only case, obviously, and then this political capitalism, of which China is the exemplar. And that binary is a really important part of the book. So let me turn to you, Marshall, first. Let's think about meritocracy. In the liberal meritocratic model, Branko talked a little bit about this sort of technical meaning of meritocracy. A lot of people, especially progressives, argue that the United States is in fact not a meritocracy. And it's come up in popular conversation recently around the college admissions scandals, around the question of elite high schools in New York and so forth. Is it accurate to describe the US as a meritocracy? Why or why not? And are there some processes that do in fact take meritocratic form?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Janet and Branko, for having me to come discuss this book. It's a great honor. Branko's been an inspiration to me as a fellow tweeting economist and a wonderful scholar, and I aspire to his level of prolificness. So on the question of meritocracy, I think this is getting a lot of pushback, I would say, among economics research that's currently being conducted. So this idea that essentially the labor market is free in the sense that people have there's no legal restrictions on their ability to attain any particular status in the labor market. And I think that what we're increasingly finding is that no labor market really has that quality to it. That is to say, the range of options that are available to any worker entering the labor market are not infinite and are not under their control. So this idea that, for example, access to higher education would determine access to a particular labor market status, as we can tell from segregation in the higher education system, from the extent to which certain institutions will lead from will protect and prolong privilege across generations. These are emoluments or ornaments of social status that aren't really available to anyone, notwithstanding the sort of stated policies of particular institutions, or the idea that we're not barring higher education on the basis of class, or particularly requiring a formal caste system where one generation inherits the set of occupations available to their parents. That is more or less what our higher education system does and what our labor market does. And I think when we're kind of wondering to what degree the sort of observed correspondence of, say, elite status in the economy with elite educational background and homogamy, these are, and investments in early childhood skills development, these are the things that economists have, at least in the past, focused on as sort of causes of social disparities and outcomes among people later in life. And I think, the sense of the research is that things like going to an elite university or being escorted to museums or to special enrichment activities on the part for children on the part of their parents, like these are things that are kind of the trappings of meritocracy, but they're not the causes of outcomes among different generations. That's really due to privilege and inheritance and social status that is not free and equally available to all.
Jamie, let me ask you almost, I guess it's sort of the mirror question, to train your lens on political capitalism, as Branko calls it. You recently quoted a Chinese physicist in something you wrote, a longtime U.S. resident, as questioning the claim that China is authoritarian or that it's only authoritarian. Can you elaborate on that? And does this physicist or your understanding of China challenge Branko's portrait of China as politically capitalist? Does it challenge this whole binary between liberal and political?
Okay, well, let me first of all begin by saying that Branko and I are longtime friends and allies in many, many matters, have pursued parallel lines of research that are very complementary. And so I assume that in inviting me here tonight, he knew he was getting the skunk at the garden party. And I want to begin with a colossal quibble about the whole structure of the nomenclature here. And I would argue that capitalism began in the 15th century, not the 19th. And that capitalism and globalization occurred simultaneously at that point, with the creation of the slave economies of the Caribbean, with the colonization of the Americas. And globalization, that 90% of the silver that was mined in Bolivia went to China through the Philippines. It was not something that was strictly connected just to the Americas and Europe. So it was an entire global economy that was created for the first time at that time. I would argue further that capitalism in that form collapsed in the 1930s and was never reconstructed successfully anywhere in the world. In the United States, what we got was the New Deal and ultimately the Great Society and a mixed economy, whose, let's say, senior descriptor or apostle of the time was a fellow by the name of Galbraith, some relation of mine, actually. And that in China, what developed out of the revolution and the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, the period of reforms, is something which is only loosely described as capitalist. It's an economy which continues to be state-directed and continues to have its major direction set by public policy. I mean, if we see this, for example, in the reaction to the Great Crisis with the major construction projects, and ultimately the creation, most recently, of a high-speed rail system, which in a decade has gone from nothing, 15 years from nothing, to the largest in the world. This is not something which could be done by decentralized private capitalists. If it could be done by decentralized private capitalists, you would see a better subway system in the city of New York than you've got. So now, to get to your point about the question of the nomenclature, political versus meritocratic, I would again raise a quibble here. Do we have political capitalism in the United States? I give you Michael Bloomberg, for example. I mean, if you have $1 billion, you can participate in American politics at the highest level, or you can pretend to have $1 billion, or you can have a billionaire backing you up. Those are the three major criteria. That strikes me as a marriage of politics and capitalism, which is very hard to dispute. Whereas in China, well, your number up here was that the top 1% had 20% more income than the others in the party. But what is the Communist Party in China? It's basically a professional association. I'm not going to defend it, but I can tell you one thing it's not. It's not Marxist-Leninist, and it's not Maoist. 25 years ago, long before the current evolution of political discussion in China, I was in Beijing on and off over a period of years as an advisor to the Planning Commission. And my Chinese friends would joke to me that I was the only communist in the place. It was, this is a place where there was actually, to be honest with you, a greater inside, not in public, but inside the official boundaries of discourse, a greater diversity of views. You had Chicago monetarists and Hayekians. The only thing you didn't have were Marxists. A greater diversity than you'll find at the Council on Foreign Relations or the Brookings Institution, both of which I have affiliations with, mind you, so I know what I'm speaking of. So again, I would say, I would question all of the labeling here as whether it is truly evocative. I mean, I know Branko's given very precise definitions and can defend them, but the labels have broader meaning, and I would question whether they're accurately evocative of either system.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to push us back to the United States. We're going to give Branko a chance to respond when we talk about democracy shortly. Let me shift gears to the second question. Branko put up a slide showing enumerating several causes of rising inequality in the liberal case of the U.S. His main example, as you know, rising capital shares, several things, you saw them, the increasing transmission of income and wealth across generations. In the book, he lays out a policy platform. This is a rather long question, but then I'm going to just turn it loose on my panel here. And the first remark that Branko makes is that just taxing and transferring, removing market-generated inequality through taxes and transfers, that's yesterday's social policy. Those tools have reached their limits. They're swimming upstream against rising market inequality. And he calls for a different approach, which is increasing endowments, which are resources that lead to prosperity. Specifically, increasing capital endowments to deconcentrate capital ownership, and that would be through tax policies. We've been talking about this a lot lately. Tax policies that would increase asset holding among the middle class, implementing effective inheritance tax, capital endowments, etc. And the second big focus on endowments is about investing in public education at all levels and reducing subsidies for elite schools. So that's a long way to say the focus is on public policies that increase the endowments of capital and education. What do you think of this policy platform? Let me start with you, Marshall. Is it bold? Is it inspired? Is it timid? Is it too narrow?
It's a good set of questions to put to me because honestly, I'm undecided about those two things. So first of all, I think Branko's not right to reject progressive taxation off the bat, and I think that comes from a somewhat narrow conception of what the point of progressive taxation is. You said, taxes and transfers are yesterday's solution to the problem of high market inequality, and for example, they can be avoided through offshoring assets and offshoring capital income, and so it's very hard for national-based tax authorities to go after increasing concentrations of capital. I think that a lot of the work that people like Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez have put out really creates a strong argument for seeing progressive taxation as affecting the market distribution of resources. So a world in which the marginal tax rate for high earners is 90% or 91% is a world in which the economy's leading corporations are run in a very different way. There's really no point in paying out dividends or otherwise transferring resources from profitable companies to shareholders if 90% of what comes out is going to be given to the government. Instead, companies are run so as to reinvest retained earnings in future earnings, so R&D, that sort of thing, or shared with workers. And I think that mechanism is underappreciated within the economics of taxation. I mean, there's almost no role for that mechanism in the sort of formal public finance modeling of taxation. And the sort of what might be seen as the technical problem of actually making it work in a world of globalized capital, I think is solvable, basically. I mean, the owners of capital themselves know where their money is, and so I think it means it's possible for tax authorities to know where it is, and to date, tax authorities have been relatively unwilling, for political reasons, to go there. So it has been presented as a technical problem is in fact a problem of politics, which is quite real. On the, how about Branko's positive suggestion? So equalizing endowments of capital, I think, is in some ways an inspiring program. My view is that capital ownership has not really been successfully decentralized in capitalist societies other than when the government owns a significant share of the productive capital. And so it's not that there could be no role for sort of individually owned capitalist endowments to deconcentrate the ownership of capital, but if we're talking about feasibility as being the reason why we can't do progressive taxation to influence the market distribution of income, then I think we should be talking about what has worked to deconcentrate the ownership of capital in the past, which is public ownership of resources. And just a word on higher education, I think, or education altogether, I think public higher education are crucial public goods. What worries me about that suggestion as a solution to inequality is that in some ways that is sort of what economists at least have been pointing toward for a long time, and what we have learned in studying how the education system actually works is there's at least as strong an argument that it has the operation of preserving and prolonging inequality and social position than it does to mitigate them. And so absolutely we need to turn to a robust public sector in education, but that can't, it's not something you can wave a wand at. That would require very significant policy changes in the way that higher education is run.
Thank you, Marshall. Before I turn to you, Jamie, I realized a bit of housekeeping. I think, is it time, Jimmy? The staff is going to be collecting index cards, which are going to come to me so that we can gather some of your questions. I think that should be happening in the next moment or two. So, Jamie, basically, equalizing endowments versus redistribution.
Well, first of all, I'm a great fan of the estate tax, not inheritance, but on estates. Why? It's the tax we've had for a century, and it has built a great many important private and public-private institutions in this country. I don't know what happens here in New York, but in Texas, every building at the university is named after some donor who's attempting to escape the estate tax. It is a way of expressing their love, while at the same time avoiding having the government come and collect it when the Grim Reaper comes to collect them. This is a very good thing. It's a socially integrating project, and it mobilizes accumulations which are inevitable in a capitalist system in advance of the death of the receiver. This is a good thing. Great many American institutions which don't exist in Europe, don't exist in Asia, are due to the existence in part of that tax. It should be tightened up. There should be a higher rate. There should be, I think, reform of the way foundations are run. But this is a very good way of assuring that you avoid dynasties, which are the major risk to a political system, in which accumulations in one generation are passed on to the far less worthy and competent children of the accumulator. This is something which is not unknown in American life, and something that we should be rigorously reforming the system to eliminate. As far as endowments, including the education endowment, as an educator, I'm not against education. I think it's a good thing. But let's not kid ourselves. Education does not change the structure of pay and incomes or capital endowments. It does not level the playing field or make it so that some educational institutions are equal to others. It's simply not the case. What you need to do for the vast working population of this country is to strengthen social insurance. That's how you assure that people are protected against penury in old age, against medical bankruptcy. This is why Medicare for All is a good idea. It makes you protect people against, we all protect people against loss of their savings with deposit insurance. A strong, and we can protect their homes, and we should have better protection against foreclosures and the kind of thing that happened to millions of people in the aftermath of the great crash of 2007. So we ought to be thinking in terms of things which are not necessarily cash in your pocket, not necessarily something you can borrow against or gamble away or lose, but which give the broad population enough security that they feel that they have a certain amount of economic and political independence, can organize themselves and take some risks that they would not otherwise do. That's not a new idea. That's the basic foundation of the American system as it developed in the New Deal and the Great Society. And that's what I think is the right way to pursue a society that is decently equal for the whole population.
Branko, do you want to respond, or briefly, may I say, and then we're going to move on to migration?
Yes, I would of course love to respond. First of all, it was actually great to have Marshall and Jamie, and of course we've been of course in touch by email and otherwise tweets and so on. So I know both of them for a long time, and I'm actually very appreciative of the comments and of the criticisms. Now, let me try very quickly to go over not all of them, only some selected ones. First, let me start with the issue of the book of China versus the US and so on. First of all, I have to say this is going maybe despite how should I say, monetary value of my book, or maybe some people will not go buy the book, but it's not the book which deals with Trump and Xi Jinping. It's not the book which deals with the trade war. I actually, after finishing the book, I went through a search and I saw that Trump is mentioned once, populism is mentioned once. So if you're interested in that topic, don't bother. It's not a book about that. It's a book which I think is taking much longer view. Jamie, of course, mentioned that, of course, going, to some extent even to 1500 and the triangular trade and remonetization of China, which was the reason why silver went to China. So it's a book which actually takes much longer perspective. And the definition of the two models is not really done for today or tomorrow. It's done, I think, actually to serve longer. And China is not the only case of political capitalism. I list like about 15 countries. Obviously, Vietnam is the one which comes closest to China. But many other countries like Algeria, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so on. And they are actually not simply listed because I kind of find it cool to list them, but the whole first part of chapter 3, of which I didn't talk because it's a very specifically Marxist part, is a part which goes into the origins or the genesis of the political capitalism and the role of communism in global history. So that's not something that I can discuss in 5 minutes, but I just want to say the objective is to give a much wider and broader view of the two systems rather than what is happening in the last 4 years or might happen in another 4 years. Now, similarly, on the issue of public policies, my objective was not, nor do I know actually the American system sufficiently, nor is my objective really to deal with the American system per se, but to deal more broadly. Why I was not rejecting, but I was saying that the policies that are being used are really reaching the limit, because I think we are in need of what we had in the 1930s when there was design, the vision of a welfare state. We need now a different vision. And I think that different vision is a society where the distribution of capital will be much more equal across income groups or social classes, and a society where the access to high level or high quality education will be much more equal. And what we have now, not only in the US, but most of meritocratic or liberal capitalist countries, we have extremely concentrated ownership of assets, and we have a rising importance of private education coming from the US and now spreading to Europe, which actually, because of their cost, de facto monopolizes the access to the top schools, which then lead to the best jobs, highly paid jobs for the people. So it was much broader. Now, when it comes to individual policies, actually, I mean, there is hardly any difference between what I say and what other people say. The differences, I think, are very small. And of course, I agree both with the critiques that Marshall and Jamie did. But I think that the differences are very small. It's the objective which is different. Do we continue with them simply because we have been using them for a long time and we want just to sort of increase them a little bit, or do we really apply them with a vision to fundamentally change the nature of society?
Let me move us on to a topic. I think I hope there'll be a thread from where we just came to where I'm going to go. For those of you who have followed Branko's work on global inequality, he's raised the issue, has raised some very provocative claims and policy suggestions regarding transnational migration of people. He talks a lot about the movement across borders of capital, but now we're talking about people, workers, immigration. So one of the arguments that came up in his last book, and again here, is that if we're thinking about global inequality, we think about the global community, inequality across all people, regardless of national borders, one way to reduce global inequality is to open borders, essentially, and let workers from poor countries move to richer receiving countries. So there are two parts of that, and I want to ask one question to Marshall and then one to Jamie, keeping us mindful of questions about democracy. So the first question is, it seems intuitively right that if you open borders and people from poorer countries move to richer countries, that global inequality will be reduced. But of course, there are many components of that. The people are exiting countries, there's a brain drain out, there are remittances in, and then they could increase inequality in the receiving countries. So is this claim even correct, that essentially open borders is going to reduce global inequality?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I also would have thought it was intuitive, and I should say the treatment that Branko gives it at the basic level is more or less orthodox, that both capital and labor, but in particular labor here, are factors of production, and equalizing the return to different factors of production across geographic areas will in general be an egalitarian policy, and the way one would do that is allowing those factors of production to move wherever they want to go, which will be the place that they have the highest return. On the question of transnational labor migration, I think it's a bit more complicated. So as you were alluding to, so we think about migrants themselves who leave poorer countries and go to richer countries, which is, I think, the model of migration that Branko is referring to. They tend to be positively selected from their home countries, and they tend to enter the income distribution in destination countries lower down relatively in terms of their relative status in the destination country. It is lower than where it was in the sending country. And then it is only over generations that you get convergence between immigrant populations in destination countries, that is children, first generation and second generation, they converge and even sometimes exceed income distributions in the destination country. So I think the migrants themselves are clearly enjoying an absolute increase in income from migration. But the question is, they're leaving the source countries, and in general, the people who leave are the people who are earning the most and highest in the social stratification. That can create this brain drain effect that you were referring to, where countries effectively have no means of conducting their own domestic economies. They become kind of, their production is people who are migrating into destination countries. That's counteracted by the remittances that flow from destination countries from the migrants to the source countries they came in. I think it's unclear exactly which of those two effects predominates. And then when you think about the destination destination countries, I think now my reading of the literature is that migration does not have a negative effect on the incomes of natives in destination countries. In fact, if anything, it may have a positive effect because migrants themselves are both workers who may be complementary or competing with domestic labor, and they're also consumers, and so in some ways they increase the income levels in the destination country. So you have, ambiguous effect on the average incomes of poor countries, positive effect on the average incomes in rich countries, and for the migrants, they're enjoying an absolute increase in income, but the sum total of all of those things is not necessarily a reduction in the global inequality. It's not to say we shouldn't do migration, that's not the only reason to allow it, but I think it's a little bit simplistic to view it just as this equalization of factor returns across geography.
Thank you. Let me turn to the second part of this question, Jamie, for you, if I may. There's another part of this argument, so that what Marshall was just talking about is really an empirical question, is what will be the effect on the global income distribution were we to have this widespread migration of labor. But there's a second issue, which I suppose one would say is more normative or political, which was previewed in the graph that Branko put up. You mentioned that this is very relevant in Western Europe today, but it's also very relevant in the United States, is the question about the acceptance in destination or receiving countries of migrant labor, of immigrants. And so Branko shows in this rather provocative graph that the acceptance, if I'm saying this right, the acceptance in destination countries would go up if we had policies and institutions in place that were granting these incoming migrants limited rights. So I guess my question for you, Jamie, is what do you think of that? Does it give you concerns, moral, economic, legal, or otherwise? And I wonder if, what I'm sure you know a lot about, within China migration, which is enormous, gives us a window onto this question about the treatment of migrants.
Well, China has a major internal migration and a regulation system, which is called the Household Registration System, HUKU. That's a whole set of issues there. But let me bring it to the case of the United States. I would want to reverse the causality on this. I don't think it's the case so much that migrants come in because they're attracted by higher wages. They are brought in many cases, by labor contractors in order to take advantage of their weak legal status so that employers can employ them at low wages and without the protections that workers who have legal rights would have. And the way to deal with that problem is to enforce adequate labor standards, a high minimum wage and labor protections which eliminate the incentive to bring in, let's say, janitors to Ivy League universities from El Salvador. That's what you want to do in order to make the system less exploitative than it is. Secondly, with respect to borders, there's an old parable. It's about King Canute. You may have heard of it. Try to stop the tides. They're not going to be able to stop them in Europe when you look at what the demographic forces are that are coming out of North Africa, out of Sub-Saharan Africa, out of the Middle East. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And with respect to what we're doing, I live in Texas, what we're doing on the border is we're creating a vast slum, a militarized slum that is of no benefit to the people who live in the valley and no particular benefit for the people who don't live in the valley. But it certainly diminishes the quality of life if people who live in this area, going to be there, are there by the hundreds of thousands or millions, are constantly at risk. Now, what we have in the United States is a provision of the Constitution enacted at the end of the Civil War, which says if you're born in this country, no matter what your parents are, you are a citizen of the United States. So our only question really legally and politically is, do we extend at some point the same general ability to become an active member with full political rights in this country to the people who come in? Because their children are going to be voting citizens in 18 years, folks. There's nothing that anybody can do about it, and it's happening all the time. And my view would be, if you come into the United States and you work, then by and large, there should be periodically ways in which people should be allowed to achieve the basic rights which enable them to participate alongside everybody else. If we don't do that, if you look at the way the demography of the country's going, we won't have the demographic advantage that we presently enjoy by comparison with countries which don't have a good flow of in-migration, which are becoming much older societies and are suffering from certain difficulties that are associated with that. And we're not so much. Why? Because among other things, we're constantly replenishing our population with hardworking people. Doesn't bother me at all.
So Branko, I'd like you to respond a little bit, and let me ask you ask you to respond in two ways. I've seen this graph, of course, in the book and in your slideshow. You often describe it as provocative. So I guess the question is this a serious policy proposal, or is it a thought experiment? Or how do you really see this in terms of implementation?
Well, it is a serious policy proposal because it is being done in the Gulf countries as we speak, and Singapore as well. So it's not something which really doesn't exist anywhere. But it deals with, I think, a deeper issue, is that are countries willing to start to abolish this binary distinction between being citizen and not being citizen? Because essentially what I argued there is that you would have people who would come to a country, they would work there for a limited period of time, their actually stay there would be limited or linked to the job, and then they would return. So they would actually have the rights, all the rights, including, of course, rights of equal treatment and jobs and so on, which, of course, in the Gulf countries they don't, but that would be treated as quasi-citizen, but they would never have the path to citizenship. Now, why am I doing that? Because am I I don't like migrants and I don't like them to come here? No. The reason is the following, is that I'm afraid, and I think it's particularly with respect to Europe, less to the US, maybe that's a different discussion, but that the resistance to higher immigration is so strong. I mean, it is such a strong political, emotional, and cultural issue that we are facing a quite likely possibility of Fortress Europe. It's actually already there. So that position would not be good for migrants, would not be good also for the countries that are going to go through really rapid aging and would end up like Japan. And that would actually, the solution to that would be this kind of sort of having a citizenship light. In other words, having some rights of citizenship, but not others. In that case, you would not have this binary distinction between citizen and non-citizen, but you would have something in between that would also be, that some people could have. Now, let me put it like another way, in a very stark way. We already have, for example, trade union organizations and others that are very concerned about, for example, everybody, regardless of whether they come from and so on, having exactly the same status. But at the same time, they are utterly unconcerned about incomes and positions of people who are actually not able to come to a given country. So you have really binary thing. So either you're here, I mean, when I say here, US, or it could be Western Europe, it could be Japan, either you're in a rich country and then you get everything, or you're not here and we really don't care about you. So from a global point of view, a position where you would actually have some rights, including the right to work here and return to your country, would be better from the point of view of global income inequality and reduction in poverty, despite the fact that I agree with all the 3 points that Marshall made, which are very difficult, because it could be that the brain drain actually has a negative impact on the emitting countries' overall per capita income, or it could be that actually there are some possibilities that actually even inequality within the country that is receiving migrants becomes higher because of the migrants. So I agree with all of that, but I think there is definitely a reduction in global poverty, and I believe there is strong presumption of reduction in global inequality with a system which is fundamentally discriminatory. So I totally agree. So we have to keep these two things, together. It could be a discriminatory system, but it might have good effects on global poverty and global inequality.
Let me ask a question from the audience, which is really a follow-up exactly to this conversation. It's a question about it's a question about progressive politics. On the migration question, the labor-based left was for long protectionist and restrictionist. But now, on the basis of global justice concerns and other matters, the left is searching for a more open successor strategy. What should it be? Marshall?
Yes, well, I mean, that's a pretty open-ended and inviting question. I would say, so it's certainly true that the labor-oriented movement in the United States is more friendly towards immigrants and other non-citizen workers now than it has been in the past. I'm not sure about the protectionist aspect of the change in time, but I think it's absolutely right to think that the inclination should be more in favor of an internationalist orientation. And I think Branko, when we say that the orientation of the US-based left has become less xenophobic, you might say, it's really with respect to immigrants who are already in the United States, but not with respect to the rest of the world's population. And so I think if we're going to talk about an agenda that embraces global inequality and international living standards, that has to amount to the United States using its power to obtain that. Where the U.S. has a great deal of power as, in country-to-country negotiations or multilateral negotiations, it has used that to really create greater disparities across borders, because that is what U.S. domestic interests want. They want to sharpen the threat of outsourcing globally, and I think that where that power exists, it can and should be used rather to raise the floor to reduce the power of outsourcing. That is what would be egalitarian. And I think to just kind of get back to what Branko was talking about, diminishing citizenship rights in the United States. That to me, that's the thing that really threatens to make global migration inegalitarian and more like a race to the bottom, because that if it's greater, if the extent to which United States citizens are placed into competition with people who enjoy fewer rights, that is the thing that will cause greater xenophobia, greater objection to opening borders in the United States. And I think rather than placing U.S. workers into competition by reducing the standards for incoming immigrants, you should raise the standards basically for people abroad.
And Jamie?
A couple of points. I don't have a global strategy here. It's over my pay grade, but I can speak to the American strategy. And I think that it's fair to say, at least in my view, that American labor is on the right track on this issue. What has happened, if you're just thinking about it in terms of a political strategy, and that was the thrust of the question for the left, where is the left the strongest in the United States today? It's in California. Why? Because that's where the labor union movement is strongest. And why is that? Because that's where, some years ago, there was a turning point in building coalitions across population groups, which has become very, very strong. And the left broadly has pluralities of millions of votes in that state right now. Where is the transition occurring? It occurred in 2018 in Arizona with the election of Kristen Sinema. A senior labor strategist said to me at that time, we own that state. Right? Where is it happening next? Georgia, where my student Stacey Abrams would be governor if the votes had been counted correctly. Where is it going to happen after that? Well, I can tell you because I live there. Eventually it's going to happen in the state of Texas, where in Harris County, an exceedingly diverse population does not have a single Republican office holder. And that movement, which is a demographic movement and a coalition, is going to eventually make that state competitive. And when that happens, the entire country will have a different political complexion than it does now. I can tell you that the Republican Party in Texas is exceedingly aware of this and very nervous, which is something that gives me a great deal of pleasure, because I've lived under them for several decades now, which is quite long enough. So that seems to me, when you think about this, thinking about building coalitions, you build coalitions with the people who are there and with the populations whose influence is certain to grow, and no matter what anybody tries to do about it.
Branko?
Just simply for the sake of, I think, accuracy, correct, I think maybe a misunderstanding in what Marshall said. The people who would come, they would not be able to undercut domestic labor by, for example, working for less. They would simply be here, or in any country they wish to emigrate, for a limited period of time, and they would not have the right to citizenship, and they would have to go back to their own country after that time had expired. But while they are here, they would have, in terms of work, the same rights that actually any other American does. So it's not really the system for sort of undermining the domestic labor, but it's a system for actually reducing poverty in the third world. So that's basically the difference.
So it's a guest worker system in a sense.
It's a guest worker system with compulsory return.
Okay. So that is not well captured by simply describing it as reduced rights. Let me ask, there are several interesting questions here. Thank you to the audience. This is probably one for you, Branko, for sure. Someone in the audience has asked, what about capitalism in Europe, in the post-socialist countries, a part of the world you know well? Is that the same or different as these two models that you've described?
You know, it leads us back to maybe also the question that Jamie asked. No, I could not, it is a book of 270 pages. I mean, obviously each capitalist country is different, you know, it's like, what does this Anna Karenina, each marriage is different, you know, so we cannot, but we still have a marriage, you know. So likewise, I think the essential features of capitalism are the same in countries which are not, I think are not countries of political capitalism. Now, obviously, Sweden is not the United States. The Netherlands is not exactly the same like Argentina. You know, so clearly there are many differences. There is lots of work on comparative, you know, on comparative capitalism. And actually, you know, this was not something that I actually could address. And you know, it's first a limited book, and I think actually it takes a sort of fairly abstract view. And I'm using the US examples first because I know them better, and secondly because there is much more work on the US done than maybe in other countries.
I think this question is focusing on Eastern Europe, though, on the post-socialist countries.
But it's not, I mean, there is no difference between Czech Republic, in my opinion, of Austria and Austria from France, and, you know, it's the same.
Yes, Jamie.
I'll just say that in 2015, when I was attempting to help the finance ministry of Greece in its dealings with Europe, the most difficult finance ministers were from Eastern Europe. They were the most ideologically committed to far-right Milton Friedmanism, Hayekian austerity policies as a matter of political ideology. The others kind of apologized for it, but these guys were really in the soup on that. At the same time, though, I have to say that just as an example of how convoluted these relationships are, the Greek government sold off the shipping freight elements of the port of Piraeus to a Chinese corporation, Costco, which I described as a situation in which the left-wing government in a capitalist country was dictating labor standards to a right-wing corporation from a communist country. So the postmodernism of these labels was really quite a lot of fun.
So one of our audience members asks, and this is going to be our last question, and I'm going to elaborate slightly from one that I had and we didn't have time for. What is the future of capitalism, which is indeed addressed quite a bit, Branko, in your book. A couple of things. You write about the U.S. in particular, the liberal meritocratic capitalism, that its advantage resides in the political system of democracy. And you note democracy is advantageous per se, but also there's an instrumental story because the consultation with the population is a corrective. And on the other hand, you argue that in China, essentially, the Chinese, this is put a bit crudely, but are really bribing the Chinese people to accept the lack of democracy in exchange for this very high economic growth. So these are sort of two pictures of democracy and the two models of capitalism. What does the future hold? Is this grand bargain in China, assuming it exists, is it sustainable? What is China going to look like in 20 years, and what about the liberal model?
Well, of course, nobody knows what China would look like. Right. But I wanted to go back to, nobody knows what the U.S. would look like in 20 years either. But what I want to say is that actually I'm too much of an economic determinist And I do believe that a system which is economically more successful would eventually, I'm not saying prevail, because I don't think that one system will prevail all over the world, but that would become gradually a dominant system. And I think what was actually interesting with China is there is no doubt that in the last 50 years, if you were to choose one country which was most successful, that's China. Then you go back into the past and you say, what was the country that was most successful in the previous, let's suppose, 70 years? Well, that was the United States. Well, the United States came to become really predominant power, not only militarily and economically, but also a power that was imitated and emulated by others precisely because it was so successful. You go further back, then of course you have the UK and the same story. So it doesn't seem to me unlikely that the country which is most successful economically with the system that it does have would tend to actually be imitated, or second point, that's of course the big point, whether historically China is predisposed to do that, whether that country would be actually willing to export its system elsewhere. So we have, I think, here in the future two questions to be asked. First, is China going to be willing to start exporting the system that it does have? And secondly, are other countries going to be willing to say, well, look, China is doing so well, we're going to imitate? And of course, like Jamie, I also have anecdotal things. For example, I was told recently the discussions with the Egyptian ministers, they are all together with OECD people and they talk and all of that. As soon as the OECD people turn and go away, they say, look, the Chinese are going to actually invest here, they're going to bring billions, so we are going to do the road, we are going to have trains. Forget about all these conferences and meetings about transparency and governance. We are not interested in that. But of course, while OECD is there, they of course talk about being interested. So, the question is actually whether this would come to pass. We don't know that, but I think these two elements, willingness of others to imitate and willingness of China to export, are really what will determine the role of China in the future.
Jamie, and then Marshall, the last word.
Yeah, I think that the issue in China has never been and is not now whether it will become a formally democratic society and anything like the Western mode. I think Chinese opinion so far, one doesn't know really what Chinese opinion is, but so far as I've in contact with it, has looked upon the Western form and it decided, first of all, it's not really democracy, and secondly, it doesn't deliver. Whereas the policy system that they do have has been delivering for quite a long time, and delivering under political conditions which have been relatively relaxed by Chinese standards, because people of my generation remember what it was like before under the Cultural Revolution, for example, and they have not had to go back to that. And so long as they don't, well, that's a kind of bottom line which creates conditions which are tolerable. So there's a very general view. Now, how do the Chinese respond to challenges? The answer is reform, the all-purpose solvent of the Chinese system. They've been reforming since 1976, the age of reforms, and when a reform generates problems, as they all do, the solution to those problems is always more reform. So one thing you can be fairly sure of in the Chinese system is that it will continue to be oriented toward this notion of reform. What that means in concrete terms depends on what problems will show up. But if the system continues to function, that is to say, to address problems, and now environmental issues are a very major problem, to address these problems as they come along, now, they continue to be reasonably successful. Can it be exported? It's an open question. China is China. Right? I think that's a lot of countries would like to be like China, but they're not as big, and they're not as stable. And so they have. Say again?
What about Hong Kong?
What about Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong is a problem now for China, but it's a small problem. Hong Kong is a city. It was once 70% of China's exports passed through Hong Kong. Now I think it's the 7th or so largest port. As a financial center, it's lost ground to Shanghai. The major development I can't read the Chinese government, I don't have any connections there, but my sense is that the Chinese government approaches these problems with a considerable amount of patience and may now have a situation in which with the elections, you have interlocutors who actually represent the people of Hong Kong, and so you might then have some possibility of negotiations which were not there before. And that would be a good thing, but if it doesn't happen, you know, Hong Kong does not have the central importance to China that it had 25 or 30 years ago. And so that's something which, unfortunately, for people who live there, is a reality that they're going to have to just be conscious of. And I'm sure they are conscious of. It's a major reason for the demonstrations is that that's the case.
Marshall, what is the future of capitalism? You have 1 minute.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the ability of China to export its model, but I do fear that the forces that are empowered by the capitalist system that we have figured out increasingly how to operate that system unchecked by democracy. And I don't mean that just in the formal sense of elections and how they're conducted and whether candidates need to appeal to major funders in order to win elections and run advertisements on TV to do so, but also in the economy overall. I think we had structures that made capitalism work insofar as it ever did by democratizing power in corporations, by making sure that there was multiple stakeholders who had to be appealed to and satisfied within the structure of the American capitalist system. And I fear that increasingly the economy lacks those things, and it's not, the course of one election cycle is not going to be, one presidential election is not going to reestablish that kind of democratization of economic power.
Before I bring us to a close, let me just tell the audience that as we do close in the next moment, there is a bookseller selling Capitalism Alone, and Branko will be signing, and the others of us will come out and chat as well. So it's my sad duty to bring us to a close. Thank you very much, Branko, and to the panel.
Notwithstanding my captious remarks, do buy the book.
Yes, and we'll get your back.
Yes.